The stagecoach driver found her walking alone on the Montana road, her wedding dress torn at the hem and stained with dust, and not a single soul following behind her to explain why a bride would be wandering the Bozeman Trail without a groom, a wagon, or a word of complaint on her lips. The year was 1878, and the territory around Virginia City had grown rough with miners chasing the last veins of silver out of the Tobacco Root Mountains, leaving behind a scattering of towns that were more tent than timber, more hope than substance. Ella Doyle had come west from Ohio on the promise of a marriage arranged by letter, the kind of arrangement that seemed sensible enough when her father had passed and left her with nothing but his debts and a trunk of her mother's old linens. The man she was meant to marry, a claims agent named Walter Prescott, had written to her for 8 months with words that sounded kind enough on paper. She had believed him. She had worn her mother's wedding dress, carefully packed and pressed, all the way from Cincinnati by train and then by coach, believing that in 3 days' time she would stand before a preacher in the town of Sweetwater Gulch and become Mrs. Walter Prescott. Instead, she had arrived to find that Walter Prescott had left town 2 weeks earlier with another woman, a saloon singer with red hair and a laugh that carried, taking with him the small savings Ella had wired ahead for their household goods. The boarding house owner, a thin widow named Mrs. Kettering, had broken the news to her without much gentleness, more concerned with whether Ella intended to pay for her room than with the wreckage of a young woman's future. Ella had stood in the parlor of that boarding house with her wedding dress still on, having worn it the whole coach ride in some foolish hope of arriving presentable, and she had felt something in her chest crack clean through, like ice breaking on a pond in the first thaw. She had not cried, not then. She had simply walked out of the boarding house and kept walking, past the edge of Sweetwater Gulch and onto the road that wound up into the foothills, because staying in that town 1 more hour felt unbearable, and she had nowhere else in the world to go. It was there, 3 miles up a rutted mountain track with the sun beginning to lean toward the western ridge, that Boone Bass found her. He had been coming down from his cabin with a mule loaded with pelts, bound for the trading post at Sweetwater Gulch to sell the winter's take of beaver and fox, when he rounded a bend in the trail and saw a woman in white standing in the middle of the road, as though she had grown up out of the dirt itself. He pulled the mule short and simply stared at her for a moment, because there was nothing in his experience of the mountains that had prepared him for the sight of a bride, alone, dust on her skirts, her dark hair coming loose from its pins, standing in the golden light with an expression on her face like she had forgotten how to want anything at all. Boone Bass was a big man, built from years of hauling timber and hunting elk through country that did not forgive weakness. His shoulders filled out his buckskin coat the way a mountain fills out a valley, and his forearms, bared where he had rolled his sleeves against the day's heat, carried the corded strength of a man who had spent a decade wrestling a living out of unforgiving land. His hair had grown long over the past winter, brushing his collar, dark brown streaked here and there with the first threads of gray, though he was not yet 40. He kept a beard, close-trimmed but full, and his eyes were a pale gray-green, the color of lichen on granite, eyes that had learned to watch for danger in every shadow and every sound. He was not a man given to talking much. 5 years alone on that mountain, ever since his wife Sarah had died of the fever that swept through the territory in 1873, had worn most of the idle conversation out of him. But he was not a man who could look at a woman standing in obvious distress on a lonely road and simply walk his mule around her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from disuse, "you are a long way from anywhere a person ought to be walking alone." Ella looked up at him, and for a moment she seemed to consider whether to answer at all, whether the effort of speech was worth spending on a stranger on a mountain road. But something about his stillness, the patience in the way he waited without pressing her, made the words come loose. "I do not believe there is anywhere I ought to be at all," she said. I came to marry a man in Sweetwater Gulch. He is gone. He took my money and he is gone, and I have no home to return to and no husband to greet me here, and I find myself simply walking because I could not think what else to do with my feet." Boone studied her for a long moment. The tear in her dress ran from the hem up nearly to her knee, likely caught on a fence post or a bramble somewhere in her wandering, and the white silk, once fine, was gray with the road's dust. Her hands, he noticed, were shaking slightly, though her voice had stayed steady enough. "That man ought to be strung up," Boone said simply. "Ain't a decent excuse in this world for what he did to you." "No," Ella agreed. "There is not. You got people back east, someone who can wire you passage home." Ella let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "My father died 6 months ago. My mother passed when I was a girl. I have an aunt in Cleveland who made it clear when my father's debts came due that she had no room in her life for me. I spent every last cent I had on the coach fare here, believing I was coming to a marriage and a home. There is no one to wire, Mr. Bass," he said. "Boone Bass. I got a cabin up this mountain about 2 miles on. I trap and I hunt and I keep to myself mostly. But I ain't in the habit of leaving a woman to wander a mountain road as evening comes on, torn dress and empty pockets besides." He paused, looking at her carefully, the way a man might look at a wounded animal he was deciding whether to approach. "I can take you back down to Sweetwater Gulch, get you settled at the boarding house for tonight, and we can send word out about what happened. Sheriff might take an interest in a man who steals a woman's money and abandons her at the altar." "I have already spoken with the boarding house," Ella said, and now her voice did tremble, just slightly. "Mrs. Kettering made it clear she has no charity to spare for a woman who cannot pay. I have $4 to my name, Mr. Bass, and no way of earning more in a town where everyone already knows my humiliation." Boone was quiet for a long moment, and Ella watched him with the wariness of a woman who had learned, in the space of one terrible day, that kindness from strangers often came with hidden costs. But when he spoke again, his voice was gentle in a way that surprised her, coming from such a rough and weathered man. "I ain't going to pretend I know what to say to ease a hurt like that," he said. "But I got a cabin with a solid roof and more meat in the smokehouse than one man can eat through a winter, and I got a spare room that used to belong to my wife sewing things before she passed. You are welcome to it, ma'am, for as long as you need to find your feet again. I ain't asking nothing of you but that you don't mind mountain quiet and mountain cooking, which is plain but filling." Ella stared at him, searching his face for the catch in the offer, the way she had learned to search Walter Prescott's letters for words that meant more than they said. But Boone Bass's gray-green eyes held nothing but a steady, patient honesty, the look of a man who had made the offer because it was the right thing to do and did not expect thanks or complication for it. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" she asked. "Because I lost someone once too," Boone said, and something moved behind his eyes, quick as a hawk's shadow crossing a field. "And I know what it is to have the ground fall out from under you with no warning at all. Ain't right to leave another person standing in that kind of hole without offering a hand up, if I got one to offer." It was not romance that made Ella accept his offer that evening. It was survival, plain and simple, the recognition that a stranger's cabin with an honest face behind the offer was safer than a town full of people who had already decided her worth based on a groom who never showed. She let Boone help her up onto the mule's pack saddle, settling in front of the bundled pelts, and she held tight to the pommel as he led the animal up the mountain trail with the sureness of a man who had walked that path 1,000 times before. The cabin, when they reached it, sat in a small clearing surrounded by lodgepole pine, with a view down the valley that took Ella's breath even in her exhausted state. Smoke curled from a stone chimney where Boone had banked his morning fire, and a linta beside the cabin sheltered stacks of split wood and the drying racks where his furs were stretched and cured. It was a simple place, but it was solid, built with the same careful strength that showed in Boone's hands, and Ella felt something in her, some small and stubborn part of her heart, eased slightly at the sight of it. Inside the cabin was one large room with a stone hearth, a table and 2 chairs, a narrow bed along one wall, and a curtained-off alcove that Boone explained had been his wife's space for sewing and mending, now emptied of most of its contents but for a trunk and a narrow cot. "It ain't much," Boone said, setting down her small travel bag, the only possession she had managed to keep hold of through the day's disaster. "But the roof don't leak and the door bars strong against the wind." "It is more than I had an hour ago," Ella said, and for the first time since she had stepped off the coach in Sweetwater Gulch, she felt tears rise up in her throat, hot and sudden. She turned away from him, ashamed to let a stranger see her cry, but Boone did not press her or offer false comfort. He simply set about building up the fire and putting a pot of coffee on to boil, giving her the privacy of his back while she let the tears fall. When she had composed herself, she found that he had laid out a simple supper of venison stew and cornbread, and he ate his portion at the table while she picked at hers, still wearing the ruined wedding dress because she had nothing else to change into. "There is a trunk of my wife's old dresses in the alcove," Boone said, not looking up from his bowl as though he had guessed at her discomfort without her needing to voice it. "Sarah was near your size, I would guess. You are welcome to whatever fits. Ain't no sense letting good cloth go to waste, and I expect you would rather not sit around in that torn thing a moment longer than you have to." Ella looked at him with surprise. "You would not mind wearing your late wife's clothes?" Something passed across Boone's face, a shadow of old grief that he did not try to hide from her. "Sarah was a practical woman," he said. "She would rather see her dresses keeping a person warm and decent than moldering in a trunk on account of my sentiment. I mind a great many things, Miss Doyle, but I do not mind that." That night, Ella changed into a simple blue calico dress that fit her almost perfectly, and she folded her torn wedding gown carefully and set it at the bottom of her travel bag, unable yet to bring herself to discard it entirely, though she suspected she never wanted to see it again. She slept that night in the narrow cot in the alcove, listening to the wind move through the pines outside, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she slept without dreaming. The following weeks passed in a rhythm that surprised Ella with how quickly it became familiar. She had expected, in the first uncertain days, that Boone would grow tired of an unexpected guest, that the arrangement would sour into awkwardness or worse. But Boone Bass proved himself, day after day, to be a man of quiet, steady decency, the kind that did not announce itself but simply showed itself in small actions repeated without complaint. He taught her, without her quite asking for it, how to bank a fire so it would hold through a cold mountain night, how to tell which of the wild plants nearby were safe to gather for the pot and which would sicken a person, how to read the sky for weather in a country where storms could roll in with almost no warning. Ella found that she was hungry for these lessons in a way she had not expected, hungry for purpose after a life spent waiting on other people's decisions, her father's debts, her aunt's charity, Walter Prescott's letters. Here, in this cabin on the mountain, she found her hands wanted work, and Boone gave her work to do that made her feel, for the first time in a long while, useful. She took over the cooking within the first week, finding that Boone's palate, though not unrefined, had grown used to the plainest preparations a bachelor's kitchen could produce. She began to experiment with the dried herbs she found in his stores, with the wild onions and berries she gathered on short walks near the cabin, and Boone ate every meal she set before him with an appreciation that was almost boyish in a man his size, his gray-green eyes crinkling at the corners with pleasure he did not bother to hide. "Sarah used to make a berry cobbler with the huckleberries that grow along the north slope," he told her one evening, scraping his bowl clean of the stew she had seasoned with wild garlic and sage. "I have not had a proper cobbler in 5 years. Ain't much good at baking myself." "Show me where the huckleberries grow," Ella said, "and I will make you a cobbler that will put your memory to shame." He looked up at her, something warm flickering in his expression, quickly banked like a man used to guarding his feelings. "I would like that," he said simply. It was in these small exchanges, these quiet offerings of comfort and companionship, that Ella began to notice things about Boone Bass that had nothing to do with gratitude for his shelter. She noticed the way his hands, so capable of splitting wood or skinning a deer with brutal efficiency, could be gentle as a mother's when he helped her over a fallen log on their walks, or when he checked a small cut on her finger from a kitchen knife, turning her hand over in his broad palm with a care that made her breath catch in a way she did not examine too closely. She noticed the sound of his laugh, rare as it was, a low rumble that seemed to come up from somewhere deep in his chest, usually provoked by some small clumsiness of hers, like the time she had tried to hang laundry on the line and gotten herself thoroughly tangled in a wet bedsheet, emerging red-faced and sputtering, while Boone laughed so hard he had to sit down on the porch step. She noticed, too, the nights when she woke from restless sleep to hear him moving quietly about the cabin, banking the fire or checking the door, a silent vigilance that she came to understand was simply Boone's nature, a man who had learned that the mountain could turn dangerous without warning, and who took it upon himself to stand watch against that danger, even when the person he was protecting had not asked him to. For his part, Boone found himself equally unable to ignore the changes Ella Doyle had brought into his solitary life. He had grown so accustomed to silence, to the particular loneliness of a cabin that had once held two voices and now held only one, that Ella's presence, her humming while she worked, her quiet questions about the mountain and its creatures, her occasional bursts of laughter at her own mistakes, filled the space in a way he had almost forgotten a home could be filled. He found himself watching her more than he meant to. The way the afternoon light caught the brown of her hair when she sat by the window mending a torn shirt of his, the determined set of her jaw when she was learning something new and refused to give up on it, the softness that came into her face when she thought no one was watching and let herself simply rest in the quiet of the mountain evening. He told himself in the early weeks that what he felt was simple gratitude for company, nothing more. He had built walls around his heart in the 5 years since Sarah's death, walls made of grief and the fear of losing something precious a second time, and he did not intend to let those walls come down for a woman who had, after all, arrived in his life only because another man had wronged her. But walls built against sorrow do not always hold against tenderness, and Boone found his resolve weakening a little more with each week that passed. The turning point came nearly 6 weeks into Ella's stay, when an early autumn storm rolled down off the peaks with a violence that caught even Boone by surprise. He had gone out that morning to check his trap lines along the creek, expecting to be back well before any weather turned, but the storm came faster and harder than the sky's earlier warnings had suggested, and by midday Ella stood at the cabin window watching sheets of rain and hail batter the clearing, with no sign of Boone's return. She waited an hour, then 2, her worry growing with each passing minute until she could no longer sit idle. Against every instinct of caution, she pulled on Boone's spare oilskin coat, far too large for her but better than nothing, and set out toward the creek where she knew his trap lines ran, following the muddy path as best she could through the driving rain. She found him a quarter-mile from the cabin, at the bottom of a small ravine where the creek had swollen into a churning brown torrent. He had slipped on the wet rocks while checking a trap, and his leg was pinned awkwardly beneath a fallen branch that the rising water had shifted, the current tugging at him with increasing force as the storm fed the creek higher by the minute. Boone! Ella screamed his name over the roar of the water and the wind, scrambling down the muddy slope toward him with a recklessness that would have horrified her a few hours earlier. "Ella, stay back!" Boone shouted, his voice strained with pain and effort. "Ground's too soft, you'll slide right into the water." But Ella did not stay back. She found a sturdy branch of her own to use as a brace, testing her footing carefully as Boone had taught her over the past weeks, and she worked her way down to him, bracing herself against a boulder while she threw her weight against the fallen branch pinning his leg. It took every ounce of strength she possessed, her hands slipping on the wet bark, the cold rain plastering her hair to her face, but between her efforts and Boone's own desperate push, the branch finally shifted enough for him to pull his leg free. He came up out of the water gasping, his leg bloodied and already swelling at the ankle, and Ella did not think, did not hesitate, but threw her arms around him right there in the rain, shaking with the aftermath of fear. "I thought I might lose you," she said into his soaked shirt, her voice breaking. "I stood at that window and I thought, if something happens to him, I do not know what I would do, I do not know where I would go." She stopped herself, aware suddenly of how much truth had spilled out of her in that moment of terror, truth she had not even fully admitted to herself until it came pouring out unbidden. Boone went very still, his arms coming up slowly to hold her against him despite the pain in his leg, his large hand cradling the back of her head with a tenderness that made her breath catch even through her fear. "Ella," he said, low and rough, "I have got no intention of leaving you standing at any window, not now, not ever if I have any say in the matter." They stayed like that for a long moment, rain streaming down around them, the creek still roaring past, and something passed between them that neither one of them tried to name just yet, but that both of them carried back up the muddy trail to the cabin like a secret held close to the chest. Boone's ankle proved to be badly sprained rather than broken, though it kept him off his feet for the better part of a week, hobbling about the cabin with a crude crutch Ella fashioned from a forked branch while she took over his outdoor chores as best she could, feeding the mule, checking the smokehouse, even attempting, with mixed success, to reset a few of his simpler traps. It was during this week of forced closeness, of long evenings by the fire with Boone's leg propped up and Ella's hands busy with mending or cooking, that the careful distance they had both maintained began to dissolve entirely. "Tell me about Sarah," Ella said one evening, the fire casting warm light across the small cabin as rain from the tail end of the storm still pattered gently on the roof. "You do not have to, if it pains you too much, but I would like to know her, if you are willing to share her with me." Boone was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "Sarah was a schoolteacher's daughter from back in Missouri," he said finally. "We married young, came out west together in '68, chasing the same foolish dream of gold that half the fools in this territory chased. Never found gold, but we found this mountain, and Sarah said it was worth more to her than any vein of silver. She had a laugh that could fill up a whole valley, and she was not afraid of hard work or hard country, though the cold winters here tried her something fierce." He paused, his jaw working. "The fever took her in the spring of '73. Wasn't nothing anyone could have done, the doctor said, not even if we had lived in a proper town with a proper hospital. But I have spent 5 years wondering if there was something I missed, some way I failed her." "You did not fail her," Ella said softly. "A fever does not care how much a man loves his wife, Boone. It takes what it takes, and no strength or devotion can always stand against it. I lost my mother the same way, to a fever when I was 9 years old, and I know my father spent the rest of his days believing he should have done something different, should have called the doctor sooner, should have moved us to a healthier climate. But some griefs are not owed to anyone's failure. They simply are, and we are left to carry them as best we can." Boone looked at her for a long moment, something in his gray-green eyes softening into an openness she had not seen from him before. "You carry your griefs well, Ella Doyle," he said. "Better than most folks I have known." "I do not always feel as though I carry them well," Ella admitted. "There are nights I still lie awake wondering what is so wrong with me that a man could promise marriage and then abandon me without so much as a note of explanation. Wondering if I am simply the kind of woman men find easy to leave." "That man was a fool and a coward," Boone said, and there was an edge of real anger in his voice now, protective and fierce. "Ain't nothing wrong with you, Ella." He did not deserve the chance to know you, not for one day, let alone a lifetime. Any man with sense in his head would count himself fortunate beyond measure to have a woman like you standing beside him. Ella felt her cheeks warm, and she looked down at her hands, twisted together in her lap. "You are kind to say so." "Ain't kindness," Boone said. "It is simple truth, and I have never been much good at saying things I do not mean." The air between them felt charged in a way it had not before, and Ella found herself looking up to meet his eyes, drawn by something she could not quite name but felt with her whole body. Boone's gaze held hers, steady and warm, and for a moment she thought he might close the distance between them, might lean forward and press his lips to hers the way some reckless part of her heart had begun to wish for. But Boone, ever careful, ever mindful of the wounds she still carried, only reached out and took her hand in his calloused thumb tracing gently across her knuckles. "I do not want to rush you into anything, Ella," he said quietly. "You came to this mountain, running from a broken promise. I will not be the man who makes you feel pressed into another one before you are ready. But I want you to know that what I feel sitting here with you, it is not pity, and it is not simple gratitude for company. It is something a good deal more than that, and it has been growing in me for weeks now, whether I meant for it to or not." "I feel it too," Ella whispered. "I have tried to tell myself it is only relief, only the comfort of having somewhere safe to land after everything fell apart. But it is more than that, Boone. When I thought you might be swept away in that creek, I did not feel the fear of losing a place to stay. I felt the fear of losing you." Boone lifted her hand then and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, gentle as a whispered promise, and Ella felt the warmth of it travel all the way up her arm and settle somewhere deep in her chest. "Then I reckon we ought to see where this leads us," Boone said, "so long as you are willing to walk that road with me, slow as you need it to be." "I am willing," Ella said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. From that evening forward, something shifted between them, subtle but unmistakable. Boone's hand found hers more often on their walks, his arm settling naturally around her shoulders when they sat together by the fire in the evenings. Ella found herself leaning into his solid warmth without hesitation, finding in his presence a comfort she had never known even in the earliest, most hopeful days of her correspondence with Walter Prescott. As autumn deepened and the aspens along the mountain slopes turned to gold, their courtship, unconventional as it was, given the circumstances that had brought them together, blossomed into something neither of them could deny. Boone took her on longer walks once his ankle healed, showing her hidden meadows where elk grazed in the early morning mist, teaching her to fish in the cold mountain streams, his hands guiding hers on the rod with a patience that made her laugh with delight when she finally landed her first trout. He took her, one crisp October afternoon, to a ridge that overlooked the whole valley, the mountains rolling away in every direction beneath a sky so clear and blue it seemed to Ella she could see all the way to the edge of the world. "I come up here sometimes," Boone said, "when the weight of things gets heavy. Sarah used to say a person could not stay sad for long looking at a view like this. Said it reminded a body how small their troubles were against something so grand." "She sounds like she was a wise woman," Ella said. "She was," Boone agreed. "I think she would have liked you, Ella. I think she would have been glad to see this cabin filled with laughter again." Ella turned to look at him, moved beyond words by the gentleness of that sentiment, the way he had made room in his heart for both his grief and his growing love without letting one diminish the other. "Boone Bass," she said softly, "I believe I have fallen in love with you." Boone's face broke into a smile then, wide and unguarded, the kind of smile that transformed his weathered features into something almost boyish in its joy. "Ella Doyle," he said, "I believe I fell in love with you the day I found you standing in the middle of that road in your torn wedding dress, looking like the bravest, most beautiful woman I had ever laid eyes on, even with the whole world having just come crashing down around you." He pulled her close then, and this time there was no hesitation, no careful restraint. He lowered his head and kissed her, gently at first, and then with a growing warmth as she rose up on her toes to meet him, her arms winding around his neck, his hands settling at her waist with a strength that felt like an anchor rather than a cage. The kiss lasted long enough for the wind to sweep past them, carrying with it the scent of pine and the last warmth of the autumn sun, and when they finally parted, both of them were breathless and smiling in a way that felt like the beginning of everything good. "I do not want to court you the way folks do back east, with long years of careful waiting," Boone said, his forehead resting against hers, his voice rough with feeling. "I have wasted enough years alone on this mountain grieving what I lost. I do not intend to waste any more time getting to what I want if you will have me, Ella. I am asking you proper this time, not out of pity or convenience, but because I love you with everything in me. Will you marry me?" Ella felt tears rise in her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy, spilling over freely as she laughed and nodded. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Boone Bass, I will marry you. I want nothing more in this world than to be your wife." They rode back down the mountain that evening with their hands joined between them, the mule plodding along at an unhurried pace as though it, too, understood there was no need to rush toward anything but the life they were building together. But before they could plan for a wedding, there remained the matter of Walter Prescott and the debt of justice that still hung over Ella's arrival in the territory. Boone, once his ankle had fully healed, insisted on riding into Sweetwater Gulch with Ella to speak to the sheriff about the man who had stolen her savings and abandoned her without so much as a word of explanation. Sheriff Amos Whitfield was a weathered man in his 50s who had seen enough of the territory's rougher characters to take Ella's complaint seriously the moment she and Boone walked into his office. He listened carefully as Ella recounted the arrangement, the letters, the wired funds, and Walter Prescott's disappearance with the saloon singer, a woman named Dottie Marsh who, as it turned out, had a history of similar schemes stretching back through 2 other territories. "We have had word of a man matching that description working confidence schemes down toward Bozeman," Sheriff Whitfield said, studying the notes he had taken. "Marrying letters, promising claims that don't exist, taking a woman's savings and vanishing before the wedding day arrives. You are not the first he has done this to, Miss Doyle, and I am sorry to say that makes it all the more likely we can build a case against him, if we can run him to ground. I do not know that I care so much about getting my money back," Ella admitted. "I only want to be certain he does not do this to another woman, another family left with nothing but broken promises." "That is a decent sentiment," the sheriff said, "and I will do what I can to see justice done. I have wired the marshal's office in Bozeman with a description, and I expect if he shows his face in this territory again, we will have him." It was not the swift, satisfying justice of a dime novel, but it was enough for Ella, who found that with Boone's steady presence beside her, the sting of Walter Prescott's betrayal had already begun to fade into something distant and almost unimportant, overshadowed entirely by the happiness that had grown in her heart on that mountain. News of the marshal's efforts came nearly 2 months later, delivered by a rider passing through Sweetwater Gulch with mail and messages for the outlying homesteads. Walter Prescott had been apprehended in a town near the Idaho border, attempting the same scheme on another unsuspecting bride, and he now faced charges in 3 separate territories for fraud and theft. The saloon singer, Dottie Marsh, had apparently abandoned him somewhere along the way once his funds had run dry, proving herself no more loyal to him than he had been to Ella. "I confess I feel something almost like pity for him," Ella said, reading the letter Boone had brought back from town, "though I know he deserves none of it. To spend a life running schemes and stealing trust, never building anything real or lasting, it must be a hollow way to live." "Hollow is exactly the word for it," Boone agreed, wrapping his arm around her shoulders as they sat together on the porch of the cabin, the winter's first snow beginning to dust the pines around them. "A man like that will never know what he is missing, sitting here with you, watching the snow come down, content with nothing more than each other's company." Their wedding took place in December of 1878, in the small chapel at Sweetwater Gulch, with a congregation far larger than either of them had expected, made up of the handful of homesteaders and trappers scattered through the surrounding mountains who had come to know and respect Boone Bass over his years in the territory, and who had, in the months since Ella's arrival, come to know and welcome her as well. Ella had thought long and hard about what to wear for the ceremony, unable to bring herself to don the torn and troubled memory of her first wedding dress, the one that had traveled all the way from Ohio only to become a symbol of humiliation rather than joy. Instead, she had spent the autumn evenings, when Boone was busy with the last preparations for winter, carefully altering one of Sarah's old dresses, a soft cream-colored fabric that she had found in the trunk in the alcove, taking it in at the waist and adding a simple trim of lace she had purchased with the last of her savings from the general store in town. "Are you certain you do not mind?" she had asked Boone the night before the wedding, showing him the finished dress, worried even now that wearing his late wife's clothing for such an occasion might stir up grief rather than joy. "I could find something else if this troubles you." Boone had taken the dress gently from her hands and studied it for a long moment, his throat working with emotion. "Sarah would be glad," he said finally, his voice thick. "She would be glad to see her dress become part of a new beginning, part of a happiness she would have wanted for us. I do not see grief when I look at this, Ella. I see continuation. I see a mountain that has room enough for both the love I had and the love I have found again." On the morning of the wedding, snow had fallen soft and light over Sweetwater Gulch, dusting the rooftops and the pines beyond the town in a clean white blanket that seemed, to Ella, like the world itself offering a fresh page after the torn and troubled one she had arrived on. She stood at the back of the small chapel, her hand resting on the arm of an elderly trapper named Silas Cobb, who had known Boone for 15 years, and had gladly agreed to walk her down the short aisle in place of the father she no longer had. And when the doors opened and she saw Boone standing at the front of the chapel, dressed in a dark wool coat that strained slightly across his broad shoulders, his long hair combed back and his beard neatly trimmed for the occasion, she felt her heart swell with a joy so complete it nearly took her breath away. Boone's eyes met hers the moment she stepped through the door, and the expression on his face, the open, unguarded wonder of a man looking at the woman he loved more than life itself, made every hardship of the past months feel not just bearable but worthwhile, necessary steps on a road that had led her exactly where she was meant to be. The ceremony was simple, conducted by a circuit preacher who had ridden in from Bozeman for the occasion, but the vows they exchanged carried a weight that neither of them took lightly, having both already known the particular pain of promises broken or love lost too soon. "I, Boone Bass, take you, Ella Doyle, to be my wife," Boone said, his voice steady and sure despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "Not out of convenience, not out of pity, but because you have brought light back into a life I had resigned to shadow. I promise to stand between you and every storm this mountain can throw at us, to work this land beside you, to build a home worth having, and to love you with everything I am, for as long as I draw breath. I, Ella Doyle, take you, Boone Bass, to be my husband," Ella replied, her own voice thick with tears she did not try to hold back. "Because you found me broken on a road with nothing left to offer but my gratitude, and you gave me instead a reason to believe in love again. I promise to meet every hardship at your side, to fill this home with warmth and laughter, and to love you fully and freely, trusting that what we build together will be worth every hard mile that brought us here." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Boone did not wait for permission before pulling Ella into his arms and kissing her soundly, drawing a round of warm laughter and applause from the small congregation gathered in the chapel, and Ella laughed against his lips, feeling for the first time in longer than she could remember that she had arrived, finally and completely, exactly where she belonged. They celebrated that evening at the boarding house, where Mrs. Kettering, in a surprising turn, had offered her parlor for the occasion free of charge, perhaps feeling some measure of guilt for her earlier coldness toward Ella, or perhaps simply moved by the story of the mountain man and the abandoned bride that had, in the months since Ella's arrival, become something of a local legend, told and retold with growing warmth around the stoves and counters of Sweetwater Gulch. The homesteaders and trappers who had come for the wedding brought what food and drink they could spare, and the small parlor filled with music from a battered fiddle played by one of the miners, and dancing that left Ella breathless and flushed with laughter as Boone spun her around the small space with a surprising grace for a man of his size, his hands sure and gentle at her waist, his eyes never leaving her face. "I do not think I have ever been so happy," Ella said, resting her head against his chest as the music slowed into something softer, more intimate, near the end of the evening. "I aim to keep it that way," Boone murmured against her hair, "for the rest of our days." They rode back up to the cabin late that night, the snow crunching softly beneath the mule's hooves, the stars overhead spread out in a great glittering canopy that seemed, to Ella, to promise every good thing the future might hold. Boone carried her over the threshold of the cabin with an ease that made her laugh, and he set her down gently by the fire he had banked that morning, now built up warm and bright to welcome them home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Bass," he said, and the words settled into Ella's heart like the final piece of a puzzle she had not known was missing, until it clicked perfectly into place. The winter that followed was harsh, as mountain winters in that territory often were, with snow drifting deep enough to bury the lower half of the cabin's windows and temperatures that dropped low enough to freeze the creek solid for weeks at a time. But Ella found that she did not mind the cold, or the isolation, or the long dark evenings, because every one of them was spent beside Boone, learning the particular rhythms of a marriage built on genuine partnership rather than convenient arrangement. She learned to can the vegetables from the small garden she had planted in the summer, to render fat for soap making, to patch and mend with a skill that grew more confident with practice. Boone taught her to shoot, insisting that a woman living so far from town ought to be able to defend herself and the homestead if the need ever arose, and Ella surprised them both with a natural steadiness of hand that soon had her hitting targets nearly as well as Boone himself. In the evenings, they read together by the fire from the small collection of books Boone had accumulated over the years, mostly practical volumes on farming and animal husbandry, but also a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets that had belonged to Sarah, which Ella found herself reading aloud in the soft firelight while Boone listened with his head resting against her shoulder, his eyes closed in contentment. Spring came slowly to the mountain, the snow retreating first from the south-facing slopes, then gradually from the shadowed valleys, until by May the meadows around the cabin had burst into a riot of wildflowers, and the creek ran high and clear with snowmelt. It was in this season of renewal that Ella discovered she was carrying their first child, a realization that filled the cabin with a joy so profound that Boone, upon hearing the news, actually wept, tears he made no effort to hide as he pulled Ella into his arms and held her as though she were the most precious thing in all the world. "A child," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Ella, I never thought, after Sarah, I never let myself hope for this again." "Well, you had best start hoping," Ella said, laughing through her own tears, "because by my reckoning this child will arrive sometime around the first snow of next winter, and I intend for you to be every bit as prepared and excited as I am." Boone proved himself more than equal to the task, spending the summer months building an addition to the cabin, a proper nursery with a window that caught the morning light, working alongside his regular trapping and hunting duties with an energy that left Ella both amused and deeply touched by his eagerness to provide for the family they were building together. He also, that summer, finally shared with Ella the full story of Sarah's death, something he had touched on before but never spoken of in complete detail, the fever that had swept through in a matter of days, the helplessness he had felt watching her fade despite every remedy he tried, the long months afterward when he had nearly given up on the cabin entirely, considered selling his claim and moving on to somewhere that did not carry every memory of her in its walls. "What kept you here?" Ella asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold. "Stubbornness, mostly," Boone admitted. "And some notion that if I left, I would be leaving her behind twice over, once when she died and again when I abandoned the home we built together. I did not have a good reason to stay, not really, not until you came walking up that road in your torn dress and gave me one." "I am glad you stayed," Ella said, resting her hand on the gentle swell of her belly. "I am glad this mountain was waiting for me, even if I did not know it at the time." The baby arrived in November, during the first heavy snowfall of the season, in a labor that stretched through a long and difficult night that tested every ounce of courage Ella possessed. Boone had ridden down to Sweetwater Gulch at the first signs of her labor beginning, bringing back not the town's only doctor, who was away tending another patient, but an experienced midwife named Rosalind Carter, who had delivered half the babies in the surrounding territory over the past 20 years. Boone paced the small space outside the alcove where Ella labored, his large hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, his face etched with a worry that Rosalind Carter found almost amusing given how many nervous fathers she had witnessed over the years. "She is strong, Mr. Bass," Rosalind assured him during a brief pause in the labor. "Strong women make for good birthings, and your wife has more strength in her than most. Go on and busy your hands with something useful, or you will wear a groove in these floorboards before this child ever arrives." Boone busied himself splitting wood in the freezing dark outside, working off his nervous energy with an axe until his arms ached, and the woodpile had grown to twice its necessary size, pausing every few minutes to listen for sounds from inside the cabin, his heart lurching with every cry that carried through the walls. When the baby's first cry finally rang out, sharp and healthy in the cold night air, Boone dropped the axe and ran for the door so fast he nearly tripped over the threshold, bursting into the cabin to find Ella, exhausted but radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in one of Sarah's old quilts. "Boone," Ella said, her voice thick with exhaustion and joy, "come meet your son." Boone crossed the room in 3 long strides and sank to his knees beside the bed, his large hands trembling as he reached out to touch the tiny face of his newborn son, tears streaming freely down his weathered cheeks. "He is perfect," Boone whispered. "Ella, he is absolutely perfect. What shall we name him?" Ella asked. Boone was quiet for a long moment, studying the small, scrunched face of his son before he looked up at Ella with an expression of profound tenderness. "I would like to name him after my father if that suits you. Elias Bass." "Elias Bass," Ella repeated softly, testing the name against the small bundle in her arms. "I think that suits him perfectly." The years that followed brought their own share of hardships, as life in that rugged territory always did. There were winters so harsh that Boone and Ella lost count of the days they spent trapped inside the cabin, rationing their stores and praying for an early thaw. There was a summer drought that threatened their small garden and forced Boone to range farther than usual on his trapping lines to make up for the shortfall. There was a scare, when Elias was 3 years old, when he fell ill with a fever that sent both his parents into a panic reminiscent of the fever that had taken Sarah years before. A fear that kept Boone awake for 3 straight nights, sitting vigil beside his son's bed until the fever finally broke and the boy's color returned to normal. But through every hardship, Boone and Ella faced the world together, their partnership deepening with each passing year into something so complete and so certain that neither of them could imagine a version of their lives that did not include the other. Boone continued his trapping and hunting, though he also began, at Ella's gentle encouragement, to raise a small herd of cattle on the grazing land beyond the cabin, diversifying their means of support in a way that gave them greater security against the uncertainties of the fur trade. Ella, for her part, became known throughout the surrounding territory for her skill with herbs and simple remedies, a knowledge she had built up over years of necessity and curiosity, treating not only her own family's ailments, but those of neighboring homesteaders who found themselves too far from Sweetwater Gulch's doctor to seek more formal care. She kept a small garden of medicinal plants alongside her vegetables, and more than one grateful family in the valley below owed the health of a child or an elderly relative to Ella Bass's careful ministrations. In 1881, 3 years after their wedding, Ella gave birth to a second child, a daughter they named Sarah Grace, in honor of Boone's first wife, a decision that Ella had proposed herself, understanding by then the full measure of grace it would take for Boone to see his past and present loves honored together rather than in competition. Boone had wept again at the suggestion, moved beyond words by his wife's generosity of spirit, and the naming had become, in its own quiet way, a healing that closed the last lingering wound of his earlier grief, allowing him to hold both loves in his heart without conflict, one a treasured memory, and one a living, breathing joy that filled his days with purpose. By 1885, the cabin that had once housed a single grieving man had grown, through additions Boone built with his own 2 hands, into a proper homestead, with a second bedroom for the children, a larger kitchen where Ella's cooking had become the stuff of local legend, and a wraparound porch where the family gathered in the evenings to watch the sunset paint the mountains in colors that never failed to take their breath away, no matter how many times they witnessed it. Elias, by then 7 years old, had grown into a sturdy boy with his father's broad shoulders, already beginning to show themselves, and his mother's quick, curious mind, following Boone on his trap lines with an eagerness that reminded Boone powerfully of his own boyhood fascination with the mountains. Sarah Grace, 4 years old, had inherited her mother's dark hair and her father's steady gray-green eyes, and showed an early talent for gathering the medicinal herbs Ella cultivated, toddling along behind her mother with a small basket clutched in determined hands, already learning the names of plants that would one day make her, as Ella often predicted with a proud smile, an even more skilled healer than her mother. The town of Sweetwater Gulch itself had grown and changed over those years as well, the Silver Rush giving way to more permanent settlement as families put down roots and built the churches, schools, and businesses that transformed a rough mining camp into a proper frontier town. Boone and Ella made the journey down from their mountain regularly now, no longer the arduous trek it had once seemed, to attend church services, to purchase supplies, and to visit with the friends they had made over the years, including Sheriff Whitfield, now grown gray and slower, but still serving the community with the same steady dedication, and Mrs. Kettering, whose boarding house had expanded into a proper hotel, and who never failed to greet Ella with a warmth that had grown genuine over the years, whatever coldness had marked their first meeting long since forgotten. It was on one such visit, in the autumn of 1885, that Ella received a letter that stirred up memories she had thought long settled. The letter came from her aunt in Cleveland, the same aunt who had turned her away in her hour of greatest need, now writing with what appeared to be genuine remorse, having heard through a mutual acquaintance of Ella's eventual marriage and evident happiness in the Western Territory, and expressing a wish to reconcile, to know her niece again, and to meet the grandnephew and grandniece she had never seen. Ella read the letter on the porch that evening, sharing its contents with Boone as the children played in the yard below, chasing fireflies in the gathering dusk. "What do you want to do?" Boone asked, watching her face carefully for signs of the old hurt that letter might have reawakened. Ella considered the question seriously before answering. "I think," she said slowly, "that holding on to anger toward her would only poison something that could otherwise be healed. She was wrong to turn me away, and I will not pretend that did not wound me deeply at the time. But I have built a life here, Boone, a life so full and so good that I find I have room in my heart for forgiveness, even for her. I think I would like to write back, to invite her to visit if she is willing to make the journey west." "Then I think that is a fine decision," Boone said, pulling her close against his side. "You have always had a bigger heart than most folks I have known, Ella Bass. It does not surprise me one bit that you have room enough in it, even for the aunt who once turned you away." Ella's aunt did make the journey west the following summer, a visit that began with awkward formality but gradually thawed into something like genuine familial warmth as she came to know her grandniece and grandnephew, and came to see with her own eyes the life of happiness and purpose Ella had built on that Montana mountain, a life far richer, in its own way, than anything the comfortable but loveless existence back in Cleveland could have offered. "I was wrong to turn you away," her aunt admitted during that visit, sitting on the porch with Ella one evening while Boone took the children down to the creek to fish. "I was frightened by my own circumstances, and I let that fear make me cruel toward you when you needed kindness most. I am sorry for that, Ella, more sorry than I know how to properly express." "You are here now," Ella said gently, taking her aunt's hand. "That matters more than dwelling on what came before. We have found each other again, and that is worth being grateful for." The reconciliation, imperfect as all such healings tend to be, nonetheless brought a measure of closure to the last remaining wound of Ella's difficult arrival in the territory, allowing her to look back on that terrible day when Walter Prescott's betrayal had left her stranded and alone, not with lingering bitterness, but with a kind of grateful wonder at how completely that darkest moment of her life had transformed into the foundation of everything good that followed. As the years continued to pass, the family at the Bass homestead grew further still. In 1887, Ella gave birth to a third child, another son, whom they named Jacob, and 2 years after that, a fourth child, a daughter named Margaret, completing a family of 4 children who filled the mountain cabin with a joy and vitality that would have seemed impossible to imagine on that terrible autumn day, when Ella had first arrived in the territory, torn dress and empty pockets, believing she had lost everything worth having. Boone Bass, now in his 50s, had lost none of the physical strength that had first caught Ella's attention on that mountain road, though his hair had grown fully silver and his face had weathered further under decades of mountain sun and wind. He remained, as he had always been, a man of few words but boundless devotion, a father who taught his sons to hunt and trap and read the mountain's moods with the same patient care he had once used to teach Ella, and who doted on his daughters with a tenderness that surprised those who did not know him well but came as no surprise at all to Ella, who had seen that gentleness in him from the very first evening they had spent together. When he had offered his late wife's dresses to a grieving stranger without a moment's hesitation, their homestead had become, over the years, something of a gathering place for the surrounding community, particularly for other women who had come west with high hopes only to face the particular hardships and betrayals that frontier life so often dealt out. Ella made a point of welcoming these women, sharing her own story freely when it might offer comfort or perspective, offering practical help when she could, whether that meant sharing her knowledge of herbal remedies, helping a struggling family through a difficult winter with extra supplies from their own well-stocked stores, or simply providing a sympathetic ear and a warm kitchen for a woman who needed to feel less alone in a hard and unforgiving land. "You have built something rare here," Sheriff Whitfield told Boone one afternoon in 1890, having ridden up to the homestead to deliver some official paperwork related to the expansion of Boone's cattle grazing rights. The sheriff, now well into his 60s and considering retirement, looked out over the thriving homestead, the well-tended garden, the sturdy cabin with its additions, the children's laughter carrying from the creek where Elias, now 12, was teaching young Jacob to fish. A man does not often get a second chance at happiness like this, not after losing what you lost with Sarah. You have built something worth having, Boone Bass, and I do not say that lightly. "I know it," Boone said, watching Ella emerge from the cabin with baby Margaret on her hip, calling out to check on Sarah Grace, who had wandered a little too far toward the garden's edge. Not a day goes by I do not thank whatever Providence put that woman on my road that autumn, torn dress and all. I have thought on it many times since, how easily I might have taken a different path down the mountain that day, might have missed her entirely, might have left her to face that road alone. I do not like to dwell on what might have been lost, for either of us, if fate had arranged things differently. Fate has a way of arranging things exactly as they need to be arranged, the sheriff said with a knowing smile. Though I expect a fair measure of your own good character had something to do with how things turned out as well. Not every man would have offered shelter to a stranger with nothing to give in return, Boone. Not every man would have seen past his own grief to recognize a kindred spirit standing in front of him. Boone said nothing to that, only watched his wife and children with an expression of such complete contentment that words seemed unnecessary. And the sheriff, recognizing a private moment when he saw one, took his leave shortly after, riding back down the mountain trail with a satisfied smile of his own, pleased to have witnessed, over the years of his long service to that territory, at least one story that had turned out entirely right. That evening, after the children had been put to bed, and the cabin had settled into the particular quiet peace of a household at rest, Ella found Boone standing on the porch, looking out at the stars spreading their familiar canopy over the mountain valley, the same stars that had witnessed the beginning of their story so many years before. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, coming to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his larger one with the easy familiarity of a marriage built on years of genuine partnership. "I am thinking," Boone said, "about how strange life can be. How the worst day of your life led you right to this mountain, right to me, and how I have never once, not for a single day since, regretted the choice I made to stop my mule on that road and offer you a hand up. Nor have I regretted accepting it," Ella said, leaning her head against his broad shoulder. "Though I confess that day, I did not have the imagination to picture how completely you would come to fill my heart. I thought I was accepting shelter from a stranger. I did not know I was walking toward the great love of my life." "The great love of your life," Boone repeated softly, turning to press a kiss to the top of her head. "I like the sound of that, Ella Bass. I like it very much." They stood together on that porch for a long while, watching the stars, listening to the wind move through the pines, feeling the particular contentment of two people who had each known great sorrow and had somehow, against considerable odds, found in each other a love substantial enough to make that sorrow bearable, and eventually to transform it into something like gratitude for the winding, difficult path that had brought them together. The years continued to unfold with the steady rhythm of seasons on that Montana mountain, each one bringing its own challenges and its own particular joys. Elias grew into a young man who eventually took over much of his father's trapping and ranching work, marrying a homesteader's daughter from the valley below, and starting his own family within sight of his parents' original cabin. Sarah Grace grew into the skilled healer her mother had always predicted, eventually studying formally with a doctor in Bozeman, before returning to serve the mountain communities that had shaped her childhood. Jacob took to ranching with a passion that expanded the family's cattle operation considerably, while young Margaret, the baby of the family, grew into a spirited young woman who eventually became a schoolteacher in the growing town of Sweetwater Gulch, determined to give the children of the territory the education that frontier life had denied so many of their parents. Boone and Ella lived to see grandchildren fill their mountain home with new generations of laughter, growing old together in the same cabin where their love story had begun. The additions Boone had built over the years standing as physical testament to a family that had grown from the wreckage of one woman's broken engagement into something rich and lasting, and entirely worth having. In the final years of the century, as the frontier itself began to transform into something more settled, more connected to the wider world through railroads and telegraph lines that had once seemed impossibly distant. Boone and Ella remained on their mountain, content with the life they had built, watching with quiet satisfaction as the territory around them grew into a proper part of the settled Montana landscape. The rough mining camp of Sweetwater Gulch evolving into a real town with proper streets and a permanent doctor, and a school where their own grandchildren would eventually learn their letters. On the evening of their 20th wedding anniversary, in December of 1898, Boone and Ella sat together on the porch of their cabin, now surrounded by the homes of their grown children and the laughter of grandchildren who had come to celebrate the occasion with them. And Ella found herself thinking back, as she often did on quiet evenings, to that terrible autumn day when she had walked alone up a mountain road in a torn wedding dress, believing herself utterly without hope or future. "Do you remember?" she said to Boone, who sat beside her with their youngest grandchild asleep in his arms, his hair now fully white but his gray-green eyes as warm and steady as they had ever been. "What you said to me that first day, when you found me on the road?" "I remember every word of that day," Boone said. "I told you that you were a long way from anywhere a person ought to be walking alone." "And I have not walked alone since," Ella said, resting her head against his shoulder as she had done 10,000 times over the years, the gesture as natural and comfortable now as breathing. "Not for one single day in 20 years." "Nor will you, so long as I have breath in my body," Boone said, pressing a kiss to her silver-streaked hair. "I made you a promise once, Ella Bass, standing in a chapel with snow falling outside. I promised to stand between you and every storm this mountain could throw at us, and I promised to build a home worth having. I do not say this to boast, but I believe, looking at what surrounds us tonight, that I have kept both promises." Ella looked out at the gathered family, her children and their spouses, her grandchildren playing in the snow that had begun to fall softly over the mountain, the same gentle snow that had fallen on their wedding day 2 decades before, and she felt her heart swell with a gratitude so complete it brought fresh tears to her eyes, tears she no longer needed to hide or apologize for, tears of pure and unadulterated joy. "You have kept every promise, Boone Bass," she said, "and more besides. You gave me a marriage worth having, when I believed I had lost my chance at any marriage at all. You gave me a family, a home, a purpose, and a love so complete I sometimes still marvel that it found me at all, alone and broken on that mountain road. It was not luck that found you that day," Boone said quietly. "I believe with my whole heart that some paths are meant to cross, Ella. I believe the same providence that took Sarah from me also, in its own strange and roundabout way, led you to that road on the very day I happened to be riding down it. I do not pretend to understand the workings of fate or providence, but I know this much for certain. I know that finding you was the greatest gift my life has ever received, and I have spent every day since trying to be worthy of it." "You have always been worthy of it," Ella said. "From that very first evening, when you offered a stranger shelter and asked for nothing in return but her company." They sat together in comfortable silence after that, watching their family celebrate around them, the snow falling soft and steady over the mountain that had given them everything, the cabin that had grown from a lonely widower's solitary refuge into the beating heart of a large and loving family, and the marriage that had begun with a torn wedding dress and no groom, transformed over 20 years into something far more precious than either of them could have imagined on that fateful autumn day. A partnership built on genuine respect, deepening love, and the unshakable knowledge that whatever storms life might yet bring, they would face them together, exactly as they had promised each other in that small chapel so many years before. The fire crackled warm inside the cabin behind them, the same fire that had first welcomed Ella into a life she had never expected but had come to treasure beyond measure. And outside, the stars began to emerge one by one in the darkening sky, the same eternal stars that had witnessed the beginning of their love story, still watching now, still bearing witness to a happiness that had proven, against every early appearance of tragedy, to be lasting, complete, and entirely, wonderfully worth having. And so their story settled into its rightful place among the mountain's long memory, not as a tale of tragedy or abandonment, but as a testament to the strange and beautiful ways that broken beginnings can lead to unbreakable endings. How a torn wedding dress and an absent groom had, in the end, made way for a marriage far richer than any that betrayal could have produced. Built as it was on the solid granite foundation of a mountain man's steady heart and a woman's remarkable courage to trust in love again, even after it had once failed her so completely. Ella Bass lived out the remainder of her days on that Montana mountain beside the husband who had rescued her not just from a lonely road, but from a lifetime of believing herself unworthy of true devotion. And Boone Bass lived out his days beside the wife who had taught him that grief, however deep, need not close a heart forever to the possibility of a second, equally profound love. Together, they had built exactly what he had promised her on the day he found her. Not merely a shelter from the storm, but a marriage, a family, and a life worth every single hardship it had taken to find it.